Hey, good morning everybody. In this video we're talking about suspension seat posts for gravel bikes. In particular, we're talking about this suspension seat post. The company USE sent over their Vybe GR seat post to me for review. And in this video we'll be taking a close look at this seat post and kind of comparing it to some of the other suspension seat posts on the market. So this is the Vybe GR suspension seat post from the company USE, based out of the UK. It's a suspension seat post meant for gravel bikes. It's got 50 millimeters of active travel. And unlike the Redshift suspension seat post and the Cane Creek suspension seat post, this seat post here uses a telescopic design. It weighs in at around 420 grams or so. It's a standard 27.2 millimeter diameter and it's a round seat post, so it will fit a wide range of gravel bikes. As far as tuning of the suspension, there's three choices: a soft, a medium, and a hard spring. Now I weigh about 155 pounds or so, and so I'm on the medium spring, and it feels just right. I wouldn't want anything softer, and I wouldn't want a stiffer spring on here either. Now the first thing I noticed is that the actuation is super sensitive. Basically the spring feels very linear, meaning that the seat post reacts to even small bumps in the road, which is good. That's actually what you want on a device meant to absorb, that high frequency, low amplitude chatter. Now, as far as technological differences between this post and say like a Redshift shock stop seat post, is that this is a telescopic seat post. So it functions very similar to how like a mountain bike front fork would work, or actually probably a better analogy would be how the Future Shock suspension headset on some of the Specialized bikes work. In fact, if any of you are familiar with how the Specialized Future Shock feels, this seat post really feels basically like a Future Shock for your butt. Now, if you're wondering how I'm getting all these shots of the seat post in action, I'm actually using this guy right here. This is the Insta360 Go 3S, and it's a 39 gram 4K action camera. One of the things that makes this camera really cool is you can take the camera and just use it in this tiny pod-like format like this, or you can put it in the action pod and it basically just becomes an action camera. It's really small, it's compact. It's got a flip out screen so that you can kind of vlog with it, frame up your shot really easily. And it's actually, in my opinion, I think a really underrated camera. So I think I'm gonna actually be using this a lot more this year. I'll put a link down in the description to this camera if you're interested. But yeah, let's get back to the video. Now, the fact that it uses a telescopic design with a physical spring has its pros and cons. One of the biggest pros, of course, is how active it feels. It really does a good job reacting to every little small bump in the road, which over time actually gives you a really good sense of comfort on the bike. The seat post actually makes the ride a lot more comfortable, especially when the roads are really rough. So I think where the seat post excels is for long stretches of just predictably bumpy trail, and it just kind of smooths all of that over. Now on the flip side, because this is essentially it's a lightly damped mass spring damper system, it basically means that there's relatively little damping in the system with respect to how much stiffness is in the system. And so if you want to get a little bit more technical, this is a highly under-damped seat post. The damping ratio for this seat post plus the rider's mass on top of it is just much less than 1, which means it's going to feel a little bit more like pogo-y or springy than you might be expecting. The only downside to that from my experience so far is that when you actually do hit a big impact, there's going to be a lot of kickback, meaning that say if you hit a pothole, the suspension seat post will do a great job absorbing it, but it'll also sort of launch you back upwards, which isn't always ideal. Now I've had several scenarios where I hit a big rut or a sudden just a rock in the road or something like that, and the initial impact is really comfortable, but then you kind of have to brace for that launching effect that the seat post invariably has. Now James Huang actually wrote about this seat post in his N-1 Substack, and one of the things that he disliked about the seat post is just how much top out that it had. Basically, when the shock doesn't bottom out, it actually hits the top of its stroke rather aggressively. And I've actually had that same experience through my testing so far as well. So if I compare this seat post to say the Redshift shock stop seat post, the Redshift post that I tried was their Pro version, which has a combination of a spring and some type of elastomer in it. That one actually does solve the issue of it being too pogo-y. So as far as the effective damping ratio, I do prefer the Redshift Pro seat post a little bit more than this, just because it doesn't kind of launch you off the seat if you hit a really big bump. Having said that, for all other types of riding where you're basically not suddenly hitting a giant bump while seated, I actually do prefer the Vybe GR just because it's a lot more sensitive than the Redshift. There's also something to be said about the kinematics, so to speak, of the seat post. The telescopic seat post feels very natural because the travel is in line with the seat tube, and somehow to me that just feels more natural. The Cane Creek seat post and the Redshift seat post both use a 4-bar linkage, and so those seat posts you're actually rotating backwards toward the back of the bike as you hit a bump. And to me that actually just took a little bit longer to get used to than this Vybe seat post here, which I jumped on and immediately felt pretty comfortable. So it is a $200 seat post. It weighs about 420 grams. Use cases for me, like this is not a seat post that I would install and use for every ride. For me, like this is a seat post that I'm going to install before a ride that I know is going to be really rocky. For instance, when I rode Mammoth Tough last year, or the WTF 50 miler in the Eastern Sierras, those trails are sandy, but there's also a lot of rocky sections. And for those types of rides, I really prefer to have like some type of suspension on the gravel bike. So for me, I would keep a seat post like this Vybe GR sort of on reserve for those bigger, more chunky rides where you know you can sacrifice a little bit of weight on your bike for a lot more comfort. Now, as far as things that I'm not a huge fan of, obviously I wish they would do something about the damping in this seat post. The small bump sensitivity is really good. The issue is the minute you add any amount of damping into a seat post like this, you take away a little bit of that small bump sensitivity in exchange for, you know, more damping and a less pogo-y feel. As it stands now, I feel like the Vybe GR is a little bit too far on the springier end of the spectrum, and I wish they would tune that damping ratio and bring it up a little bit closer to 1. As far as the build quality, it's really good. There's no play, you know, torsionally in the seat posts. I've been riding it now for like a month and a half, so I can't really speak to long-term longevity, but so far I have had 0 issues with it. As far as like losing that initial small bump sensitivity, it still basically feels like new several weeks later, which is definitely a plus. And then one last thing that I'll mention is that when you do set up this seat post, or really any suspension seat post for that matter, it's kind of like a mountain bike suspension. You've got to account for the sag, which is the amount that the suspension is going to be compressed just nominally while you're sitting on the bike. So when I first set up this seat post, I set it up to the same height as the stock rigid seat post. But then while I was riding, you know, I noticed, hey, the seat feels really low, and it's because it was probably 10 to 15 millimeters lower than I was used to riding. So when you do set up a suspension seat post, you've got to account for that when you set it up. You will have to set the saddle height a little bit higher than you're used to, so that while you're riding, the saddle height is where you want it to be. As far as how it fits among the other seat posts on the market, this is definitely way up there for me. It's high quality. It's got that small bump sensitivity. I just wish they would do a little bit to bring up the damping in this system so that it doesn't feel quite so pogo-y. Now, if you have any questions about my experience with this seat post so far, just drop them down in the comments. I'll do my best to answer as many as I can. That's going to do it for this one. Thanks again for watching. Thanks for subscribing to the channel. If you haven't already, we'll see you next time.